Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I've got Alex Dalziel, my guest tonight. Alex is a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, an Ottawa-based public policy think tank. He's worked for over 20 years in Canada's national security community before joining the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. He writes and speaks on national security and Arctic geopolitics. He's got a bachelor's and master's degree in history from Memorial University of Newfoundland and Labrador, and has also studied in Finland and Germany. And he's going to talk tonight a little bit about China and Russia and what's happening with Putin's invasion of Ukraine and China's sort of cooperation. And do we have this sort of axis of countries that are allied against NATO? Alex, welcome to the show.
Brian, thanks so much for having me.
I really appreciate it. So, you're an expert on the Arctic. And I've had people from Macdonald Institute on my show before, and others that have been saying, you know what, the Arctic has been forgotten, and Russia is taking action in the Arctic, and China also, and we need to be worried about our sovereignty in the Arctic. Tell me, what do you think China and Russia are currently doing? What are their designs on the Arctic? And is it something we got to be worried about, or is it just, it's a big, vast ice wasteland, and we shouldn't even have to worry about it at all?
Yeah, all those things can be true, except for not to be worried about it at all. We should definitely be thinking about this, and for a few reasons. So I think first off, the Arctic for Russia is an extremely important part of the country. I mean, first, basically because it constitutes such a large part of Russia's north, as well as a massive Arctic coastline that extends over 24,000 kilometers. So this is just simply a big geographic part of Russia. It's been important for the Russians for a long time. I mean, dating even, previous for centuries, even before the Soviet Union, and certainly now in the years since. Well, what we've seen is that there was kind of a lull, as there were with many Russian things in the 1990s, when they faced, the transition, the failed transition to democracy, and had a lot of economic upheaval. That has begun to shift within a few years of Putin rising to power in the 1999-2000 period, as Russia looked to reconstitute, in many cases, much of its effort. So there's a few parts of that we can unpack over the next little while, in the context of post-2022, with Russia's, full invasion of Ukraine. The Arctic has become more important. Meanwhile, on the China side, the Arctic is much less important, I would say, among all the different questions that China has to deal with, but it has its own particular importance. And this is because it fits into China's perception of what China should be looked at, how it should be looked at, and what sort of influence it should have on the international stage. So the Arctic, has picked up in attention since the early 2000s, and again, consistent with so much of what we've seen in China under General Secretary Xi of the Communist Party. That a more assertive China on all fronts is what we're experiencing. So in the case of the Arctic in 2017, China put out a white paper, and in that they called themselves a near Arctic country. Now they've backed off this a little bit because it probably didn't have the intended effect, which probably from their side was more mollifying to show they were interested. Instead, it kind of caused concerns amongst all the Arctic countries, and I would actually include Russia in that list. But the Arctic is basically a piece of a polar policy. So both Antarctica and the Arctic are important for China. And we can also expand on this because there's some economic dimensions to this, but there's also some strategic ones. And then I think maybe just before we fully embark on this, it's important to think about the two of these countries and their cooperation and what that does for each other. So the Arctic is only one piece of that, but it's very important to keep in mind how much right now both of those countries are benefiting from their cooperation, and to put that in context.
Why would China be interested in the Arctic? I heard that a couple of years ago they were bidding on a mine in the Arctic, a Canadian mine in the Arctic. That there was some people that thought made a lot of sense. Get some foreign direct investment in the Arctic and help develop a mine that Canada had not invested in. And others went crazy saying, oh my God, this is Communist Party that's going to control one of these critical mineral resources in the Canadian Arctic and close to some military establishments. And therefore, they'd be able to spy on or take over control of a military establishment that we've got in the Arctic. Why would China, which I think of as nowhere close to the Arctic, be interested in the Arctic?
Mm-hmm. So we can break this down into a few pieces. So, in terms of what you're referring to and investment broadly, particularly in mining, but as we'll see also in infrastructure and in science, again, China has seen this as an important area for it to be, partly for international prestige, partly because of climate change and its sense that it should have a say in all regions where climate change, is a factor. And obviously the Arctic is one of the places climate change is being seen most rapidly and most extremely. There is kind of an international science vantage point, which certainly applies in Antarctica and how it's approached, but also polar science is seen as, an international activity by a number of countries, not just China, but I mean, many friendly countries to Canada. And then there's, the kind of, I would say, strategic balancing questions. That's a little in the longer term. Economically, the Arctic would offer a few things to China. So you've mentioned the mines. So China is the world's dominant, producer of what we're calling right now strategic minerals. So critical minerals and these rare earth elements that are so important to computer manufacture, chip manufacture, renewable energy manufacture, such as solar panels, batteries, and some of these tools. So in order to keep that dominance, the Arctic has been one small, I would say, but place that China has looked at. And these have been investments in northern Canada, in Greenland. I mean, they were quite interested in Alaska, certainly in different parts of Russia. So they see another opportunity there to get involved with, kind of shoring up their position in that sector. They've given a broader label to this. They have what's called the Belt and Road Initiative. So this is a massive infrastructure investment initiative that covers basically the world. It has a special piece called the Polar Silk Road. And the Russians have picked up on that a little more in the last couple of years. But this is, again, an idea that somehow interconnectivity between East Asia, between the Pacific Ocean and Europe and the Atlantic Ocean can be facilitated through the Arctic. Now, this could also be the Canadian Arctic, through the Northwest Passage. But given current circumstances, China is really finding, most of these mining investments, et cetera, they have failed, at least the upfront part. So, they're currently a bit of a, in a bit of a difficult situation with the Nordic countries, Finland, Sweden, Norway, and Iceland, as well as in Greenland under the Kingdom of Denmark, and then with Canada and the United States. So Russia has really become their only option for pursuing some of these interests in the Arctic. I think it's important to keep in mind, this is not the most important thing for China, certainly on the international stage. But as my recent paper was arguing, it is a component, and it's a component of this very important relationship with the Russian Federation.
You mentioned climate change. Let's talk about that for a minute, if we could. My sister worked with Environment Canada, and she was saying that the climate change, you could argue is going to be a net positive for Canada because a lot of those areas in northern Canada that are, not conducive to growing crops could become very attractive from a crop growing standpoint. The Northwest Passage might become passable all year long. And so, clearly for people that are fearing that we may not get climate change under control, the Arctic, the North, might actually become an incredibly important territory in the world. And the Northwest Passage, I understand, is actually shorter between China and Europe than it is to go through Panama because of the curve of the Earth. So is that something we should be concerned about?
Well, so that's, I'm certainly not an environmental scientist, so that's a complex question, and I think you have to think about soil conditions and many other things. So, there will be, the way I tend to look at this when it comes to climate change is that certainly in the Canadian North, it will be a very large challenge. Even as the ice melts, say, over the next 25 years, navigation will become possible, but will be very difficult. And one of the kind of curious features of the North American Arctic is that it'll probably be the last place to lose its ice. I mean, just there's a few aspects in how ice is formed in the Arctic and where it drifts and where it collects, and the kind of fact that this is a big collection of islands, allows the ice to jam up in there. So, the trend line is clear. The ice is melting. And, over time, maybe by, in 75 years, there will be ice-free complete seasons most of the time. Now, on the shorter term, it's variable. And I think this is one of the big comparison points between the North American Arctic and, again, this kind of North Asian Arctic, the north of Russia, is that that the navigational situation, say in the Northern Sea route, and that's typically what you call the Northeast Passage. So instead of going, from the Pacific to the Atlantic over North America, if you go over Asia, it's frequently called by what the Russians call it, which is the Northern Sea route. It's much shorter. It's something like 4,000 kilometers shorter. So in optimal sea conditions, you're going to save a lot of fuel and a lot of time. The challenge is that the navigable season is only about 3 months of the year, even in the Russian Arctic. The Russians are pushing very hard to expand that, partly through having more ice class vessels, but also through larger risk-taking calculations on the sorts of vessels that they're willing to let pass through. So I think, climate change, the other part I think we need to think about in terms of climate change in the Arctic is sea level rise, because that will also play havoc, as will permafrost melt. So if we're talking like the outlook for the research I've been doing is about over a decade, I think we're likely to see more complications introduced by climate change than sheer upfront opportunities. But I think that the message again here is that over time, consistently what we've seen since the 1980s, is that the ice is melting and navigation is becoming possible where once it was impossible. It'll still be treacherous, but again, it'll have some options. Maybe one thing I'd add here is that, I think there's a difference too between using this route for container ships, for a lot of the on-time shipping that characterizes the Suez Canal and the Panama Canal. Again, because of the ice conditions, the variability, the fact that weather is still quite harsh in all these northern routes, really makes it hard to ship that way. But however, things bulk carrying, whether it's oil or, minerals or other things that are maybe a little less dependent on right on time, that's likely where we're going to see the growth in the coming, say over the next decade.
Fascinating issue, Russia and China and cooperation in the Arctic. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back in just 2 minutes with Alex Dalziel of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, an expert on the Arctic sovereignty, and Russia and China. We're going to talk a little bit about Russia-China cooperation, what happened this past weekend, and what he thinks the future lies for. It's almost like we're separating again into two different axes of influence, one that is NATO and one that is not. And it'll be interesting to hear what Alex has to say about all this. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Our guest tonight is Alex Dalziel of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. He's an expert on the Canadian Arctic and also about Russia and China and what's going on in the Arctic for all of these countries. And so it's going to be an interesting conversation tonight about what's going on in our Arctic and what Russia and China have got to play. I got to tell you, this gentleman has got really an impressive background. He's got a certificate in Russian and Baltic area studies from the University of Eastern Finland. What would cause you to want to go to Eastern Finland to study? And then Memorial University Bachelor of Arts, University of Bonn in Germany, a certificate in Transatlantic Summer Academy, Political Science, History, Economics, and Culture. And then Memorial University, he's got a Master's of Arts and MA in History and Analytical Skills, International Relations, and Foreign Policy. And then a fascinating set of experiences where he worked in the Privy Council office as deputy director, looking at defense and threat analysis. He worked at the Canadian Border Services Agency as a senior analyst. He was an intern at the World Wildlife Fund and a junior analyst at the United States Information Agency. And then more recently, he has worked at the Privy Council office, as I mentioned, the Canadian School of Public Service as director of geopolitics and national security learning program. And for the last year and a bit, he's been a senior fellow with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. What an impressive background, sir.
Thank you very much, Ryan. Yeah, it's let's say I've had a career and an academic background. It's taken me a few places, and I've had until last year, I had the honor to serve Canadians as a public servant for better part of 2 decades, or over 2 decades, in fact. And yeah, now I've stepped out into the think tank world and have the opportunity to speak more directly to Canadians and international audiences about Canada and national security and defense.
So for 12 years, you worked in the Privy Council office, and the Privy Council office, I understand, is like the main office advising the principal secretary to the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister about what's going on. And you were specializing in threat analysis, identifying trends, leading analytical teams, relationship. Like, my God, that must have been quite the job.
Certainly a lot of pressure when you're serving that. So yeah, the Privy Council office is basically the central policy ministry in the government. Who's the minister of peace of the Privy Council office is the Prime Minister, and as you mentioned, the clerk of the Privy Council, who's the most senior public servant in the country, is effectively the deputy minister. So yeah, you're serving cabinet, you're serving the Prime Minister. So it's some high pressure, tight turnaround, mean deadlines.
So threat analysis, you may not be able to talk about this, but let me ask you, we've had a dramatic change in the world. We've now got, a war in Eastern Europe. We've got a war in the Middle East. Some people are thinking there's a chance of something happening in Taiwan. 5 years ago, were governments thinking about this as a possibility, or were all these a surprise? I remember interviewing Marcus Kolga of the Macdonald Institute in January and February of, what was it, 2021? I can't remember now. And he was one of the lone people that were saying we should watch out. Putin is actually massing people at the Ukrainian border and something's going to happen. And the vast majority of people were saying, no, he's not that stupid. It won't happen. So were you in the Privy Council office? Was the Prime Minister, were people in governments around the world thinking that we could actually have 2 or 3 wars?
Mm-hmm. As you said, Brian, of course, I'm kind of permanently bound on some of these things to not speak too freely. But I mean, I think when you look at the world situation, certainly 2013-14 was a bit of a watershed. Again, with Ukraine, we need to constantly be thinking that this war started much earlier. I think we also need to keep in mind the 2008 financial crisis as well was a big shock to the system. And when President Xi took over in China, I believe in 2012, 2013, China became much more assertive than it had been before. Some of these perennial issues, I think, in Canada, there's been a challenge. And I think the challenge is, I started off talking earlier about Russia's geography, Canada's geography. I mean, we're very fortunate that we have, the world's still most powerful country next door, and we have a friendly relationship with that country. There's some road bumps. So I think it's taken some time for much of the political class, elements of the bureaucratic class, et cetera, to fully come around and understand. And frankly, we're not the only ones in this respect. I mean, the Baltic states, Poland, some of those countries were, sounding the alarm. Australia has been ahead of the game. Taiwan, these are countries that have had to understand this if they want to survive. So I think we're still a bit slow on this. Each government over the years has had its particular strengths and weaknesses when it's come to responding to this situation and particular preferences. My big concern, and this is a lingering one, is that the amount of investments that have been made in Canada's kind of international portfolio, as I call it. So that's the military as the kind of lead ticket item, but it's also our diplomacy, our embassies, our foreign aid, our intelligence services, overall our investments in keeping Canada present on the international stage and understanding that, the multilateral world we were in, and the very, comfortable relationship with the United States, that period is over. I mean, with the United States, it's not that it's, necessarily going to get better or worse. I mean, there's going to be challenges in this relationship, but the Americans are going to consistently look to us to do more. You'll remember when Obama came to Ottawa and it was, we need more Canada. And I think a lot of people kind of collectively patted themselves on the back for that one, when I think in reality it was saying we need Canada to step up. And this has been a message that's come up a bit. So, it's a hard task, of course, predicting a lot of these things. I think when it comes to the Russias of the world, the Chinas of the world, we need to attend to what they say. We need to attend to what they say and not decide for them what is smart and not in their interest. And that's hard to do because we tend to project our own views frequently. It's obviously when it comes to something like the invasion of Ukraine, Russia and the decision making there is literally one man at the end of the day, as much as it is a system. I tend not to be too hard on fellow analysts, having been one of them, whether they're in government or outside, in calling these things exactly right. The issue is having the ability to respond properly, and some of that response is to the immediate, but some of that response is, not even a response. It actually looks like proactive. And I think that's the challenge we face right now, whether you're talking foreign interference, whether you're talking defense spending, we need to make the investments in institutions that when we hit the expected, challenges with Russia, China, or the unexpected, and whether that's another terrorist attack, whether that's another example of, say, sabotage or something we talk about, we really need to work hard to get those institutions kind of muscled up and toned up and ready to go. Macdonald-Laurier Institute, we're really pushing on this. I mean, we think Canada's got a bunch of work to do if it wants to improve our national security in today's context, whether that's to do with digital, whether that has to do with energy security, whether that's to do with traditional defense security, whether that's societal resilience and social cohesion. There's a whole bunch of challenges on the well, not even on the horizon. They're here right now, and they'll keep coming.
Why would you leave the Privy Council office as a deputy director to become a think tank guy?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. I mean, think tanks have a number of upsides, and there's some challenges in Canada. Most of our allies have a fairly big network of think tanks that do defense and security issues. Canada's still kind of in the early phase of doing this. So I saw an exciting opportunity to kind of, give myself the second half of my career a new challenge, which was to get out there. Having served senior level clients in the government, and I should point out, I've also served a lot of frontline people as well, particularly when I was with Border Service, et cetera. There's really valuable work there, and I took a lot of honor in serving, the senior officials and also making sure, a lot of the people doing their day jobs and often their night jobs, had the information that they needed to be effective. So a little bit of taste for the new, a little bit of wanting to get out there and push the public debate.
I'm intrigued that you did post-secondary education in Finland and Germany. How has that benefited you?
I would say immensely. Particularly the case in Finland, I was very fortunate to have a full year to study there, and was introduced to it actually from traveling in Russia in the 1990s. So, Finland is a very unique history with the Soviet Union and then the Russian Federation, in terms of, it fought two wars against the Soviet Union during the Second World War. It survived, unlike almost every other country in Eastern Central Europe. It avoided Red Army occupation. It lost some of its territory, but it kept the Soviets out. It had to dance a very kind of knife edge for certainly during the late 40s, 50s, and 60s, managing the Soviet Union, and really wasn't able to, fully express its national goals, in terms of becoming part of the European Union in the early 1990s. Until the Soviet Union disappeared. So, I mean, it gave me a different perspective, on a country that has really faced, sharp threats to its democratic institutions, to its economic institutions, to its basic freedom and survival. Germany was a more kind of concentrated experience where I was fortunate to be there for a month. I hit Germany at a point when it was going through the transition. And if you looked at the recent European Union elections, and with the polling in Germany, Germany's still struggling to kind of bring its East and West together, with a lot of the dividing lines around voting, still apparent through that. So again, I think, any chance you get as an international affairs analyst to kind of see firsthand, understand the perspective of those of folks, And right now, I think I feel very fortunate. I had the chance to live in Ukraine, in Odessa, a city that has been regularly targeted by the Russian Federation. And, to understand a little bit of the Ukrainian mentality and why there's so much fight in them, I think has served me extremely well. And, again, with the Finns and Swedes joining NATO, this is a big boost for us to get two countries like this. Finns, they never made some of the bets that many countries made after the fall of the Berlin Wall, that somehow this, the countries of the former Soviet Union would have an easy transition into the European community, particularly when it comes to Russia. And yeah, so I mean, the Finns were they kept their military. They kept their military strong. They kept conscription. And the Swedes really have, even though they did make a lot of reductions to their military, they really have first-rate technology, particularly if you're talking ships and airplanes. So we're very fortunate to have these folks coming in, and it's another example of how Putin's decision to ramp up this war in 2022 has backfired.
Given your experience in Finland, were you expecting them to make the change and join NATO, or were you thinking that they would stay neutral?
So one of the issues that always been, at least ever since 2014, and there'd always been a bit of up and down, that when there was, instability in Russia, or, the war in Chechnya, then the Crimean occupation, support for NATO would shoot up. But, there'd always been a bit of a sense amongst Finns, the opinion polling showed that if their leadership was more open to this, then they would be more open. So what we had happen, in the lead up to Russia's February 2022 invasion of Ukraine, is that Russia started making demands about what security in Eastern and Central and Northern Europe should look like. And really what they said is that, Finland and Sweden should be permanently disbarred from joining NATO, in so many words. That was unacceptable. And both the leadership, but particularly the people, started to change. And so it pivoted quickly. Was I surprised? In one sense, I understand that it was very hard for the Finns to give this up, because they had a successful model. It worked for them during the Cold War, and they were reluctant to see that go. But many people I had talked to on the ground over the years, friends, etc., I mean, they knew where they fit, right? I mean, they would they were very close to NATO as it was in terms of the relationships they had. And, they would exercise with NATO. They weren't exercising with the Russian Federation, their armed forces. So to that sense, it was always clear where it would fall when the trouble hits.
Comments about East Germany versus West Germany in the most recent German elections are interesting, because I've read numerous stories, and I guess maybe I'm not reading the right stories, but I haven't heard the interpretation that you just provided. My sense is that the Green Party was decimated, and that the right wing of the German electorate grew dramatically. Are you saying that it was different in what was the former East German versus the former West German in its political persuasion?
So in the recent European elections, I mean, there was a general shift to the right with, central kind of center-right parties doing strongly. And then, of course, the concerns around further right parties doing well. What we've consistently seen in Germany is that, in the East, what would have been East Germany, the parties of the extreme left and right tend to do better. So AfD, this Alternative for Deutschland, the current kind of hard right party, and also historically, I think it's called Der Linke, the left wing kind of post-communist party. Those two parties have typically done better in Eastern Germany than in the West, and some of this has to do with some of the challenges that they faced economically. They've had a lot of out-migration, and various other challenges. Plus, there are other factors in terms of many people grew up, in the Warsaw Pact area, the Soviet bloc, and could speak Russian, still had some access to that world. So there still are some lingering issues. I mean, it's not in the sense that we need to be worrying about German unity or anything or like that, but political sensibilities can be quite different.
I've asked you about your experience internationally. I've asked you about why you would leave the Privy Council. I got to tell you, I do that because I think it's spectacular that you've had the private sector and the public sector experience, and the Canadian experience, as well as the international experience. I think that is key to having successful civil servants that can serve our country better. And so I congratulate you for the diversity of your experience and thank you for the role that you play. I think too often people think they've got to be only one thing forever. And that I think is a huge mistake. And you rob yourself of, the breadth of experiences that you have. We got to take a break for some messages. We're going to come back in 2 minutes and we're going to delve back into the topic of Alex Dalziel's most recent paper on this Eurasian China-Russian cooperation in the Arctic. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Alex Dalziel. He is a senior partner at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, a think tank in Canada. He specializes in Arctic and Russia and China. And he's recently released a whole package of information, academic articles on the China-Russian dynamic and what it means to Canada and the transatlantic community. And it's interesting. I'm going to read a paragraph from his recent post, if I could, because I think it sets the scene. The aim was to give a geopolitically lensed perspective on the development and security of the far north. The core of the argument, the Arctic is going to figure more and more in the China-Russian relationship. Post-February 2022, China is Russia's best prospective partner there, and the Arctic is essential to Moscow's Eurasian Asia-Pacific pivot. China has the money and resources, but deterioration of Beijing's standing in North America and the Nordic countries means Russia is the only option if China wants to have an active Arctic presence. The central takeaway is that as long as China is in the competition with USA and Russia is at war with Europe, the CCP and Moscow will have passed their differences and find common ground in the Arctic.
Yeah, that's
interesting.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and that's kind of, captures the core of the argument. So a few things are going on here. So in the context of what's happened since 2022 with Russia, sanctions have really ramped up from the European Union, from North America, a broader community of countries, Japan, Taiwan, Singapore, Australia, are involved in kind of trying to put economic pressure on Russia and pay a cost that way. The big thing that's happened here is Russia losing its pipeline natural gas market in Europe. Basically, it had a number of pipelines that carried natural gas for European customers, and this is largely dried up. Some of it's still there, but very, very little. So this is a huge blow to Russia's.
Are they not shipping just as much to China and India?
So there's challenges here, right? So with natural gas, you really need a pipeline. If you don't have a pipeline, you need to have liquefied natural gas carriers. So special ships that can actually carry this. So the aim is to move that and to sell it. So oil is very easy. You can adjust that. You get it on a ship. You can find lots of ships. You carry it. You move it. It's more flexible. And certainly India and China both have picked up a lot of the slack. They're taking advantage of this situation. Russia's paying, below market prices for what it would have gotten before. I mean, it varies, but something like 10, depends on what the spot price is at any moment. But it's, they're getting a bargain on oil. Natural gas is harder because of the reasons I just mentioned. So, what they've looked at, I mean, since 2014, we've seen some more pipelines go in, but there's not enough infrastructure connecting Russia's oil and gas industry to these markets to get away from using sea routes, basically, as the extra capacity. So this is where the Arctic comes into play, in that last year we started to see crude oil, for instance, coming from the Ural Mountains and kind of central Russia, actually being shipped to the Baltic, going on to tankers, and then circumnavigating the continent along this northern sea route to China. Now, these are only a few shipments. Most of it's not going that way. In fact, most of it's going through the Suez Canal. But it is an important, continuing proof of concept, if you will, for that possibility. And the Chinese, the Russians are definitely more open to this in terms they're even allowing non-ice class. So by that means ships that aren't, don't have the reinforced hulls, et cetera, that are required or, in the Arctic in most situations. And sometimes they were letting these go through without icebreaker escort. So we've seen a higher risk-taking calculation there. They've also removed a bunch of the environmental and other kind of things that would have slowed down investment in the Arctic to try to make it more appealing. And the Chinese at the same time, I think it's very important to understand, they're keen on alternate routes for shipping to the Atlantic Ocean, right? Despite all the different tensions between the United States and China, Europe and China, there's still massive trading relationships that go on here. And, China right now has to go through, kind of around Southeast Asia, where there's some very difficult choke points, the Straits of Malacca, where piracy is a problem, various forms of crime and kidnapping. I don't need to add about what's going on in the Red Sea, leading to the Suez Canal with the Houthi rebels, etc. So there's always these choke points to getting to some of China's most wealthiest markets in Europe. So the Northern Sea route, which is still negligible compared to these routes in terms of the volume. I mean, I think you're talking like something like a couple of million tons of cargo last year was completely transshipped. Versus, it's a perishingly small number versus what goes through the Suez and Panama canals. But China will be keen to continue to push on this. And their risk calculations, from what we've seen from business people, are considerably different than what you'd hear from a lot of European and North American shippers who talk about this route. So that's one of the big changes I think we're seeing there, that, as an immediate Arctic dimension, and speaks to this increasing importance of the Arctic as an enabler for China to kind of diversify the risk portfolio for its transit routes. And for Russia, it's really the only way in the next decade, to get the capacity to move the volume of, particularly oil and gas, but other things as well from northern mines, et cetera, that are opened in a few places, to get to not just China, I mean, also to other markets in the Asia Pacific. And the Russians still call it the Asia Pacific, not Indo-Pacific. They reject that terminology, but they're very much keen on this pivot. So their pivot is part of in this paper's argument, is that, much of that pivot is going to occur through the kind of, some of it through the Eurasian landmass, this kind of the terrestrial land border between China and Russia, but that really the sea route has a bunch of value for both sides in meeting kind of immediate and medium-term needs.
The Arctic, I understand, also has a lot of critical minerals, and that's something that's of interest to China, Russia, Canada, etc. Is that also a factor in people's attention to the Arctic?
It is, for certain. So again, we go back to China's extremely dominant position. And China is interesting with rare earth elements and critical minerals, that, I mean, it actually has huge reserves. Not only does it have the processing capability, so the sort of downstream, it also has its own very significant amounts of these. So China would be number one, and Russia is number two in terms of, different assessments on how much of these minerals they actually hold. Canada and Greenland are also significant, as is Alaska, but these are the two biggest countries. So, China has an interesting dilemma, and I think this is where we can talk about, to some extent, where China and Russia, what are the limits and what's shaping the relationship, is that, China wants to maintain this dominant position. Russia's not done a great job so far in developing its critical mineral rare earth industry. There are some joint investments going on in the north, but there's a lot more potential there. Something to watch over the next few years is whether, Chinese companies will invest more. I mean, the trend is up. There's a number of problems here. One is that Russia is still a very bad investment environment, and nothing the Chinese do with the Russians is based on being friends or being nice. And that's a critical, I think, thing to keep in mind, that this is an interest-based relationship. And I mean, and a ruthlessly interest-based relationship. So there's a lot of very core interests that they're serving, but the Russians aren't going to do, or well, probably vice versa. It probably applies both ways, but particularly the Chinese aren't going to do anything with the Russians that they don't think is in their interests. So the Chinese are kind of keeping the Russians in one way, in that subordinate position, so they can demand the most possible if it comes to building another pipeline, which is being talked about for oil. And in terms of natural gas, it looks like they're actually kind of pushing the Russians right now to look a little bit more towards Kazakhstan and some of the countries that fall in between them. to kind of reduce its exposure. Because in some ways, China is probably not happy, or at least in the initial phases, was not happy with Russia's choices about Ukraine, but it has massive benefits in continuing to support Russia and making sure Russia doesn't lose. And I think that's the evolution we've seen.
So, Alex, you've outlined sort of the issue or what's happening. What do we do about it all? You think about Biden with the whole chip strategy, where he's trying to make sure that China doesn't get the most advanced chips and that they actually get reshored to America. Trump has been talking about renewed tariff war or higher tariffs against China. We've certainly in the last several years since either Trump or the pandemic, we've had this whole comment about reshoring or friendshoring and a trade war, maybe even with China. What's your recommendation? What given this axis of Russia and China in the Arctic and elsewhere, what if anything should we do about it?
Well, I think there's a couple of very high level things we need to do. And so again, as I said in the beginning of that quote you read, one of the benefits of looking at this is, through a geopolitical perspective. So geopolitics is about the geography, but it's also about the assets that countries have. So if you look collectively at what North America holds, this is, whether it's in the north or in general, but Alaska, northern Canada, and Greenland, and we need to keep Greenland in mind here. There's a very large amount of territory and a lot of resource potential and a lot of economic development potential for all of these places. It's also the case that in Europe's far north, they actually have a number of the major rare earth and critical minerals deposits that have been discovered. So there's a lot of potential there. And then you also have the fact that, there is still a degree of oil and gas development from in the United States, in Alaska, and Norway is still very eagerly developing what oil and gas it can and is looking at its most northern waters as well. Canada and Greenland have put moratoriums on this for the time being. And I think in Canada's case, we have enough in the oil shales and off the coast of Newfoundland, et cetera, we probably don't need to go up there for the high costs. And of course, there'll always be debates about land use, et cetera, in that case. So one thing I think just to get around to it is that, Canada, North America and Europe need to be looking where they can collaborate, and not just on defense, but on economic and trade. And I mean, Canada's well positioned on this. We have a trade agreement with the European Union. With the U.S., a lot of the trade has stalled in the current kind of protectionist phase we're seeing, successively through the Trump and now the Biden years. So some of these things that you've spoken to are an ongoing challenge, I think, for Canada to manage and for our Nordic and European partners in keeping the U.S. engaged. Now, where the U.S. is very engaged is on supply chain, and as you point to, some of this friendshoring and other concepts. So, there's a lot of talk between Canada and the United States on this, regular meetings at the highest levels. Greenland and the United States have kind of a strategic agreement on this, as does the European Union with Greenland. And, the EU has a big policy on reducing its dependence on China for a lot of this. So I think we need to work very, very hard at making sure, the dynamic trade relationship can continue to work, because we want to have as much scale here as we can, and, if we're going to lose this flexibility of, globalized markets on these sorts of things, and sort of the lack of concern about geopolitical risk, I think we would benefit us greatly to make sure that we have a transatlantic perspective and can draw on our Australian and other partners as much as possible. I think there is a defense piece to this as well in terms of the response. And I'm happy to say that in the most recent defense policy update, Canada did a couple of important things. One is to make the Arctic kind of the central selling point for Canada as a member of the alliance, of the NATO alliance, and starting to take seriously, or at least acknowledge that we need to take seriously, and our allies expect this, our defense obligations in the Arctic. So that's the high level one. kind of a level down is that we started calling it a northern flank. And Canada had been very, very reluctant to admit NATO to the Arctic, to have it considered in the strategic kind of conception of the Arctic. Finland and Sweden joining NATO, I think, really pushed this over the top in that Canada could no longer talk this way. I mean, if we want to have leadership in the Arctic, we have to kind of reassess the parameters of this. And our allies are an asset here. Many of them are Arctic countries, as I mentioned, but others are countries that have considerable power and ability to work with us and have expressed their unhappiness, whether we're thinking of the French or the British, in varying degrees of diplomatic nicety. I think they've called us out on not spending enough, not investing enough, and not taking this obligation seriously. I'd add another point on this that, I've talked about defense and economics, but, it's really crucial at the end of the day that we do some of the basic infrastructure things right. Icebreakers being at the top of that list. And there's a lot of progress on this, but we really need to get these polar class icebreakers. I mean, the Russians literally have dozens of icebreakers. Some of them are nuclear powered. The Chinese are headed towards having their third, heavy icebreaker, like a full polar class icebreaker. The US and Canada are both struggling to get these new vessels constructed. So we need to focus on this. It's a basic issue of presence, of infrastructure, of present, of how do I put it, like for communities there, et cetera, to know that Canada, is there, that the federal government is there, that we're taking these broader interests more seriously.
Alex, several commentators think that Canada's lost influence and respect internationally because of our lack of spending 2% of GDP, our NATO commitment, because of the small commitment we have to our defense, that we didn't play a role in Haiti when asked, that we don't have the frigates, the airplanes, go on and on and on. What's your assessment? Have we lost influence?
I think we've lost influence. I think we, the 2% of NATO, I mean, it gets debated a lot, but, it's the reason it's a percent, right? It's a basic measure of any country's, commitment to the alliance. We've promised to do this, yet we continue to play kind of a game. And the current government clearly bears the responsibility for the last few years. But, we need at least certainly the two major political parties to come out and, commit to 2%. And, we continue to see this sort of dance that's been well rehearsed in Canada, for the last two, PMOs, Prime Minister's offices, where, we're talking about getting to 2% one way or another, but being creative, like we need to get there. And 2% is a floor. I mean, if we're talking Poland and these countries, and Poland is the same size of us and is not as wealthy a country, it's well over 3%, so, this is doable for a country of 40 million people. This is something that we can manage. We have the wealth, and I think it's an acknowledgement that hard power has its place, right? I mean, it's not to get into wars; it's to stay out of them and to show that you have the credibility. So I think on the Arctic, it is a major thing our allies are looking for. If you can't kind of take care of your own backyard, their perceptions of you as an ally are going to suffer. And the Arctic isn't the only piece here, right? We need to be taking the world more seriously. And Canada's big challenge, I think, which again, the defense policy update does a good job, is articulating we're a Pacific country, we're an Atlantic country, we're a continental country. We have all these different relationships to maintain. And I think we've been in a position to pick and choose kind of over the years, certainly since the end of the Cold War and, over the last, say, 20 to 30. Where, we kind of felt like we can kind of selectively come in. Again, a country of 40 million, our allies think, wow, you guys can do a lot for us. And we're in the world. I mean, the idea that we're exempt from this, I mean, again, if all the allegations of foreign interference, et cetera, that we've seen coming out don't show, I mean, whether you're talking about those activities, I mean, we're a target. And if we appreciate, the ability to trade, the ability to have strong partnerships with countries throughout the Indo-Pacific, throughout Europe, Latin America, Africa, beyond South Asia. These are the investments you have to make to have basic credibility. I had a great chat with an Estonian official just last week, and they talked about, investments in that country, literally a country right on the border with Russia, where companies are willing, to invest, where companies see a good investment environment because they're part of NATO. right? So, I think we've come to forget what some of the foundations are of prosperity. And, spending on defense is kind of, some people call it an insurance policy. If Canada wants to step up, it's not the only thing we need to do. We need to show initiative on a lot of stuff. And I think that's the part that a lot of the debate maybe misses. It's not just about a big price tag. The price tag is there. I mean, there's no question. Canadians, like politicians, need to start talking truth to Canadians about this. But, some of it, is initiative. It is, coming up with ideas that improve the international security environment. And a few more of those need to be on the hard side of security. I mean, we do some smart things. I'm thrilled about the initiative Canada's taken with Sweden and Qatar about, kidnapped Ukrainian children, et cetera. This is, smart diplomacy. But we need to do some, signature hard power things with our closest allies.
We got to take a final break. We're going to be back in 2 minutes with Alex Dalziel talking about Russia, China. Stay with us, everybody. Back in 2. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I really enjoyed chatting with Alex Dalziel from the MacDonald Law Institute about Russia, China, his paper about what they're doing to cooperate in the Arctic, and also a lot of other geopolitical issues. And so I got to ask you, Alex, we've got this Russian invasion of Ukraine. We've now got a war in the Middle East. I read this weekend that Lebanon, looks like we could have a war between Lebanon and Israel. Iran's obviously playing a role. People are worried about China. Do we have to worry about World War III?
So we're certainly in a moment where I think, the reality of conflict, major state conflict has increased. So, if we look at what's going on, we have, a country like Russia that's very dissatisfied with the post-1991 security settlement, has shown it's willing to use violence to achieve its means. In the People's Republic of China, we've seen this increasingly aggressive stance with Taiwan. A part that most of the world recognizes is actually part of China, but that, the kind of two systems, one China, but two systems. And it is a democratic system and a free market system, and is in many ways a very exemplary democracy. So, again, I think the threat of war there is real. I mean, I think it's naive to not think that that's a realistic, more than a possibility, but probably a probability. Now, is it inevitable? No, it is not. I think in the Middle East and other places, and maybe with all of these questions, we are seeing a little bit of the question around how the U.S. disentangles, and a general thing about, U.S. fatigue and the USA's own statements about, whether it wants to kind of return to an isolationist model of the 1930s and before, and or continue to have this kind of role of guaranteeing a lot of stability, but it wants a new negotiation, a new arrangement there. Countries like Canada and European countries are well positioned to spend more on defense and to take a more forward role here. I think countries like Iran in particular are pushing on this. And it creates a lot of destabilization. Without the United States in some of these places, the equation is completely different. So I think we're in a very delicate period of international relations. And, again, preparedness, you have to work to prevent that outcome, because it would be, could be horrendous.
So I got to say, Alex, I apologize. We're running out of time.
Please,
but
jump on in.
Given what you've described, if there was one time in history we should be spending 2%, now's the time we should be spending 2%, because of your comment about you spend it to maybe stop a war. And so even if there isn't a probability, but there is a possibility that what we showed could happen, a world war. Let's get our act together and start spending the money we need to spend. That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you, Alex Dalziel, for joining us. Really interesting conversation. I remind you all, I'm on every night at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online at www.saga960am.ca. Good night, everybody.